And in fact, we could say it this way. God desires that we take risks. With any investment, there's risk. And so he desires us to risk investing what? Investing our all. Give your all. Oh, I'm afraid to give a part of my life because I haven't got it all figured out. Give it all. So welcome to Life as God Intended. Thanks for tuning in and subscribing to the channel, sharing it with your friends. I love to hear from you. Recently, we've gotten a few more comments than we have in the past. It's always a delight to interact with you, and so thanks for doing so.
So recently, a listener requested that we discuss the parable known as the parable of the talents in chapter 25 of the book of Matthew. And I want to encourage you, if you haven't, to send your requests over to us so that we can discuss and talk through them in future broadcasts. Don and I love to hear from you, hear your feedback. So any ideas, questions, or topics that you'd like us to address, please send us those directly, or you could simply add a comment down below in one of our videos as well. Don, would you kind of give our listeners a little bit of a summary of the parable as we kind of get started?
Sure. That'd be a good place to start. Well, the parable of the talents has many similarities to the parable of investments. So you have the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they kind of overlay, and each author has sometimes a little different view. Sometimes they talk about the same thing, sometimes they don't. And so there are several parables here together where Jesus is obviously making a point. And so this parable of the talents and the parable of investments kind of tie hand in hand. And in the parable of investments over there in Luke chapter 19 is the famous story of the tax collector Zacchaeus. And if you remember those child songs, Zacchaeus, you come down, because he climbed up that tree, the sycamore tree. And so Zacchaeus, it's a fascinating story because here he is coming to Christ the King. He obviously wasn't a believer as that parable begins, but Zacchaeus invites him to his house, and you can read the parable to get the rest of the story. But in the story of the parable of the talents, Jesus tells of a rich man who has 3 servants, 3 slaves, and it's interesting because he gives each slave an amount of money. And these are referred to in the parable as talents. And the master of the slaves gives these talents based upon the man's ability to take advantage of them. So what we would refer to as the individual being a good steward and being able to care for the money, being able to care for the talent that was entrusted to them. And so, as I said, there's 3 that are referred to in the parable. The first steward is given 5 talents. The second is given 2, and the third is given 1. And so the master tells them to, care for his money. And so the first 2 servants use their talents, and they trade, and they gain profit. And so when the master returns, they turn in not only the money that they were entrusted, but they had doubled his money. They had doubled the talents. And yet the third one, he was fearful. So he was fearful, and so he hid it. He hid the 1 talent because he was, that he was entrusted with, because he was afraid of losing this valuable talent which his master had given him. And there's all kinds of implications to that. Probably the way he viewed his master had a lot to do with it. And so as the parable goes, the master scolds him and says, you worthless slave, I gave you this to invest, and you didn't. You should have at least put it in the bank and got some basic interest. You didn't do anything with it.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a pretty, I don't know if I would say surprising parable, but it's definitely has one of the more negative repercussions or, consequences after that. So what would you say is kind of the significance of the parable?
Yeah, some people, kind of see this just in terms of money and money management. And in fact, the friend that asked me to talk about this, that was kind of his perspective. And my initial response, I said, I haven't looked at the parable for a while, haven't done any freshening up on it. But I said, my gut response would be that this is about servants being derivative. In other words, taking what God has given them and deriving from God as their ability to use what God has given them. So that's kind of the core of what I see in this particular parable. But the context is clearly fascinating, because when you read the Gospels, it's clear that Jesus was about to go on a journey. And, it wasn't fun and fancy free. It was, he's getting ready to face the cross. So he's getting ready to go through the death, the burial, the resurrection, the ascension, and eventually the Pentecostal outpouring. And so the moral of the story, the thrust of the story of the parable, is that he wanted to entrust all that he has and all that he is himself to his servants, to his disciples, to those who follow him in grace. I'm entrusting myself to you. Now, what kind of servants, what kind of stewards are you going to be with my life? That's the essence of this parable, and it's fascinating. And so he uses this parable to illustrate that it's the Christian's privilege. It's the Christian's responsibility to experience Christ as our life. And that, we have this most valuable gift of all, this treasure in earthen vessels, the indwelling presence of Jesus Christ, the saving life of Christ. And he has invested himself fully in us. Imagine that. Something like, "Whoa, Lord, what have you done? Did you know what you're doing?" Obviously, he knew what we were doing, that we might fully be expressions of him for his glory and for the benefit of others. That's the essence of it.
So I think kind of like what you mentioned, people look at this parable, and I know I have in the past, and just thought specifically in terms of money, right? Mm-hmm. Investing, getting a return on investment, things like that. What is kind of more of the spiritual application then of this parable?
Well, obviously, two of these servants were receptive and faithful. So that's the main focal point, although there is the negative aspect. And so we are to be receptive to God's grace, which requires a relationship, requires us to be present, which requires us to kind of know our master and to know his intent, and then to allow his grace, allow the activity of God's life in us to be enlarged. We're not, hopefully we're experiencing the reality of what it means to be Christian more than we were a week or so ago. That we're growing through our endeavors as to experiencing and increasing as we experience the abundance of Christ's life. And so this parable, the spiritual significance is that a good and a faithful servant is a person who's really functioning as God intends, and thereby enjoying the joy of participating in God's grace, and not just in theological terms, enjoying life together, knowing how to walk, knowing how to talk, knowing how to be involved, knowing how to invest, and being available to the greater development of God's grace through their lives. And so, that's what we should excite us. It's not a stagnant relationship that we have. On the other hand, there is the unfaithful servant, who is kind of like the religionists of our day, who play it safe. And they play it safe because their view of God is one who is demanding, he's authoritarian, he's a judge, and they live in fear of being, judged based on their behavior and how well they performed, how well they invested. And therefore they minimize their grace opportunities. I'm constantly talking with people. Well, how do I do that? Well, how do I experience Christ as my life? Well, if I could tell you, you couldn't do what I told you anyway. Part of this is the practical, experiential reality of you allowing God to reveal, and you allowing God to build relationship with you, and you stepping out by faith and experiencing. And so oftentimes the unfaithful servant illustrates those of us who have relied upon religious practice. And our view of God has been more of God being a rewarder of our performance. That God, He's got this checklist and He's wanting to know how well you've behaved. And so many people are fearful of not measuring up. They're fearful of making a mistake. And oftentimes I like kind of do a little shock therapy, like get over making mistakes. Like you're going to make them. Well, don't they have consequences? Well, they may. But, God will work it to your advantage. In other words, allow there to be some movement. And so instead, they kind of hide what God has entrusted them, and they choose the safer routine or the safer route of religious rituals and practice, neglecting to grow in their relationship with what God's entrusted them with. And so they never really have experiential reality in their Christian life.
It seems pretty clear, obviously, from what we've discussed in the past, but also just in kind of what we're talking through today, that Jesus came that we might experience His life, right? His life, perfect life. And often people have confused the purpose for His coming, thinking that He would change things politically, right, by setting up kind of an earthly kingdom. That's certainly something the disciples didn't understand for a while. They went back and forth and were very confused for some time. So how do these parables in this context of Scripture kind of speak to these issues?
Yeah, these parables are definitely in a kingdom context. And that's a great question, Caleb. Jesus, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, came to earth to receive a kingdom for Himself and then to reign in people's lives. Everybody wanted Him to set something up here. Well, they missed the point. He invests Himself in us in various ways through various talents, and thereby intends us to depend on His indwelling life to bring, can we say, a return of grace, a return on His grace. He does not intend for us, to kind of hoard or bury His resources that He's given to us, fearful of loss, fearful that we wouldn't maybe, behave quite the way we should. And in fact, we could say it this way. God desires that we take risks. With any investment, there's risk. And so He desires us to risk investing what? Investing our all. Give your all. Oh, I'm afraid to give a part of my life because I haven't got it all figured out. Give it all. Be all in. Give your entire lives for others. Of course you're going to make mistakes. Of course you're going to lose part of your investment if it were. But God will redeem it, and God will help you to understand how to walk it out. And so religion hides the treasure of Jesus' activity in safe places of, church ritual or morality, fearing to invest all that God has entrusted due to their own self-interests, due to their own personal interests. And so, therefore, self-interests are simply these flesh patterns of sin that people continue to allow to be controlling their lives. And we've developed these over the course of our life, for sure. But notice where we derive this selfishness from. We didn't get it from ourselves. We derived it from Mr. Selfishness himself. And so Satan is self for self, as we've said many times. And so these learned selfish patterns only look out for the interest of ourself and not others. Be willing to give away what you have. God's given it to you freely. Give it away. Let God be the one that determines how you live relative to the talents that He's entrusted you with.
Would you say that this parable is about money, or and about how God wants us to invest wisely with our financial resources, or is there maybe more to it than that?
Yeah, well, certainly I would say that there's application to money, but it's not exclusively about money. As I said, I think this is about us understanding what it means as a Christian to derive what we've been trusted with from God, and then to use it kind of liberally. And so it's interesting. This is an interesting question because as I said, the person that asked me about it thought it really did have to do with money, and he was concerned as to whether he had properly invested enough in the kingdom. And so it has a far broader context than simply being good stewards of the monetary things that God's entrusted us with. Certainly it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be those stewards of that. But Jesus wants a return on his investment relative to all that he's invested in our lives. And so it might be great for us to ask ourselves the question, what kind of return is he getting from your life? What kind of return does he want from your life? I would suggest that it's Christ's objective that his grace activity, again, be enlarged as we are receptive to whatever God's doing by faith. His grace is very dynamic, and it's active and it's alive. There's no telling what God can accomplish through us if we're simply readily available. If we'll take the risk and make the step of faith. And therefore, as I said, it's risky because we don't know what the outcome is. And so many are afraid. And I don't want to just make this in terms of a business adventure, but I've been talking to a couple people recently that are thinking about taking a step of faith and starting a business. It's more than that, but it is that as well. It's a great illustration of it. We must learn to trust him as we walk by faith, doing whatever it is that he's saying. It was Jesus himself in the Gospels in Matthew 16 that reminds us, he says, whoever wishes to save his life will lose it. That's the unfaithful servant here in the parable. He's going to lose what was given him. It was taken away from him, and it was given to the faithful servants. And so whoever is willing to lose his life for God's sake will find it. Or again, in Matthew 6:26, Jesus reminds us, he says, where your treasure is. So often we're hindered from experiencing Jesus as our life by faith because we're afraid of losing what's precious, what's our treasure. And yet Jesus says, where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. And so, again, give your all. It's been freely given to you. Don't hold on to it. Let it go. Allow it to be invested in the lives of others.
That's a really good point, Don. And I think kind of like what you're explaining here, I know whenever I first heard this parable, I kind of had a narrow view of its meaning and interpretation, specifically around money, just because that's primarily how people would teach it. And so, but I think it's pretty obvious that if we only view it that way, we may have, missed God's intent on how it can have, broader application in our lives.
Yeah, it certainly can. And that's frequently the case. And so, and I think it has a lot to do with our religious training. Religious belief has often robbed Christians of literally experiencing what this channel is based on, experiencing the extraordinary life of Christ. What does that look like? Well, that should look like Jesus as you. And often we've been robbed of that due to greedy concerns. As Paul wrote to Timothy, he said, for the love of money is a root of all sorts of evil. And some, by longing for it, have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. That's 1 Timothy 6:10. And so there's a lot of practical application for that verse for us today. And so, oftentimes people have viewed God as this somber, authoritarian judge, and they don't really have an intimate relationship with God. And as a result, they view God as someone that keeps a ledger of performance. Like God's up there with this investment portfolio, seeing how well whether it's stocks, Bitcoin, gold, silver, or whether you're just keeping it under the mattress. And so they fear not having profit, not measuring up. They fear based on performance standards of religion. And Jesus, on the other hand, he's a just and a compassionate Savior who desires for us to experience life as God intended. you're one of his children. Of course, he knows you're going to make mistakes. That's not your intent. If you do make a mistake, he's not going to judge you for making this mistake. He already knows you're going to make the mistake. He's going to love you into relationship so that you more effectively experience his life, not making as many mistakes as you had previously. And so in this way, his investment of grace, we could say, brings capital gains and enlarges our lives. And as a result, because we become these investors of grace, we are characterized as worthy investors of grace. What a neat thing to think of ourselves as. He gives talents, that is, greater resources, that we might grow and expand in our functional capacity as recipients of his grace to bless others. And sometimes people say, well, why hasn't God given me more? Why would he? You're not even taking advantage of what he's already given you.
Yeah, I love the analogy of a worthy investor of grace. Would you kind of elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, I like that too. As I was kind of prayerfully preparing for this, that kind of came to me. So to those who are proven faithful investors, he gives more and more and more grace. Don't worry about where it's going to come from. To those who refuse such, their opportunities for experiencing grace will frankly be removed and given to those who have proven themselves trustworthy, to be fully dependent on Christ, having learned to derive from him. Yeah, see, this idea that God gives us something and then expects us to go on our own and to make something out of it, that's an erroneous concept. No, we're deriving from him. So for Christ is the treasure which is hid in the field. And so we should go dig it up and then allow him to use it through us. And yet too often, the citizens of this world want a kingdom that they can be in control of. And I see that in too many Christians' lives as well. Christians are always worried about how they can cash in on God's benefits for themselves. What a selfish thing to think of. They think of that in terms of material goods and services and investments, which reveals really a selfish motive. And so they thus begin to kind of despise Jesus, and they don't even, in a practical sense, allow him to rule and reign over their lives. And so they're refusing the grace of God, which is only realized by sacrificially giving of oneself, as Christ would direct without reservation. What's holding us back if it's not fleshly desires and Satan's temptation? And so a true investor of God's grace is all in. He's all in and holds nothing back. So I hope this isn't offensive to somebody. I'm not a poker player. Okay, but it's a great analogy. I think they use chips when they play poker. And so if you have chips that represent cash resources and you think you have a good hand, you'd say, I'm all in, and you put all your chips in the center of your board. You're risking it all. And so to use that analogy, God wants us to be all in. And for to everyone who has will, in other words, each of us that wills, will be given more. And those who give their all will have abundance. But from the one who has not, in other words, the one who, I'm just going to hold my chips, I'm not cashing in, it's going to be taken away. They're going to lose. They're not going to be playing long. And so Jesus wants a return on his investment. Think of that. He wants a return on his investment. He wants us to be true investors of his grace, giving our all to him and allowing him to be the producer of all that he does in and through our lives. And so I hope that encourages you today. And as I said, thank you for your comments on this particular subject. We hope that you were encouraged and blessed by this video. We would love to hear from you and get your feedback and interact. If you have a testimony that relates to today's discussion, please share it below in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and click that notification bell so you don't miss any of our broadcasts. Be sure to check out our blog on our website, which is in the description below. And if you'd like to support our work financially, we have also provided a link. And until next time, may you experience life as God intended.